Hey everybody, this is week 2, lesson 2. This is the midline and amplitude lesson. So we're going to go over midline and amplitude of trig functions. Keep it in mind, you should have your note sheet readily available so that way you can follow along and take notes throughout this video. This note sheet is a little bit different because you're going to have some problems on here that we're not going to go over in the video. I put some on there for you guys to try on your own, some own practice, just that way you guys know if you're understanding the material. So let's get started on this midline and amplitude. So midline, that is the middle of the graph. So that's just wherever the middle of our graph is at, where our function lies. For our parent functions, it's at 0, so just right in the middle. Again, it's the halfway point from the minimum to the maximum. So if we're looking at this one on the bottom, my maximum value, the highest that my graph goes, is at 1. The lowest that my graph goes is down there at -5. Halfway between 1 and -5 is -2. So my midline, sorry, that's not a straight line, but my midline is right there at -2. That's the middle of my graph. It's just right in the middle of it. So there's my midline. Amplitude. Amplitude is how high your graph goes from the midline. So it's from your midline to your maximum or from your midline to your minimum. It's basically that distance from your midline to the peaks, however far those are. So to find your amplitude, or the formula for amplitude, it's right here. You're going to take your maximum value, you're going to subtract away your minimum value and divide it by 2. So maximum minus your minimum divided by 2 gives you your amplitude. That's the formula for it. The way that we write trig functions is through this basic trig equation. Just like how a linear function has a basic equation, quadratic functions have a basic equation, all of those other kinds of functions have basic equations, so do trig functions. So the basic equation is y equals a sine or cosine. Those are interchangeable. They mean the same thing, so sine or cosine can be right in there. B of x plus d. The two main things that we're going to look at today in this equation are what the a stands for and then what the d at the end stands for. So looking at that a first off, a stands for amplitude. It's like your slope. It's going to be your first number, and again, your amplitude is your distance from your midline to your maximum or your minimum. So again, that very first number in your equation, that's your amplitude. That's going to tell you how high or low we go from our midline. And then the number at the bottom or at the end, that d, that's your vertical shift, also known as your midline. So in this equation, that last number gives us where the middle of our graph goes. And then that first number tells us how high we go from that middle, how high up we go and how low we go from that middle point. Those are the two really important parts of this function, or of this equation right now. Your video number 3 will talk about that b value and that frequency a little bit. But for right now, we're just focusing on the amplitude, that first number, and your midline, that last number. So before we get into how to graph these trig functions, just kind of looking at sines versus cosine graphs. We graphed them in the very first video. So kind of just going over them in this one. Your sine functions, they always start in the middle at your midline. They kind of go up to the top, they hit your midline again and go down to the bottom, and then ends in the middle as well. So kind of the pattern for sine, it goes middle, high, middle, low, middle. That's going to be the pattern that you want to know and kind of remember for sine. So middle, high, middle, low, middle, because you're going to need that coming up. So middle, high, middle, low, middle. That's how we get those values, or that saying. For cosine, your cosine graph starts high and it ends high as well. So kind of that same thing for cosine. It would be high, middle, low, middle, high. So again, your cosine graph starts high, goes to the middle, goes down low, goes back to the middle, and then ends up back at high. So sine starts with your middle and ends with your middle, ends at the middle, starts in the middle. Cosine starts high and ends high. Those are the difference between sine and cosine, just by looking at them. So to graph a trig function, there are 3 different steps. There's 3 steps to it. We're going to graph this function y equals 3 sine of x minus 1. Down at the bottom right, I have a parent sine curve, so you guys know what it looks like, what we're going to base it off of. So the first step that we're going to do is we're going to start at our midline. So here's my graph. We're going to start at our midline. The midline is that last number in our formula. So right here, that -1 is my midline. So I'm going to draw in a line just that way I know where I'm at. So there's -1. And then we are going to go up our amplitude. So our amplitude is 3, meaning that from -1, we're going to go up 3 and we're going to go down 3. And I'm going to draw in those lines. That's going to be how high my graph goes and how low my graph goes. It's never going to go above that orange line. It's never going to go below that orange line. Those are kind of like the limits. That's how high and low it goes. And then step number 3 says to follow the pattern of sine or cosine. Since my function is a sine function, I'm going to follow this sine pattern. And that sine pattern goes middle, high, middle, low, middle. So notice that I kind of plotted those at the 0, 90, 180, 270, and 360, those kind of markers on our unit circle. Same thing, middle, high, middle, low, middle. And then you can fill it in with some more points just to kind of see that curve a little bit more. But there's our y equals 3 sine of x minus 1 curve. All right, we are going to graph another one, this time a cosine function. This one is on your note sheet. It is going to be the last one on this second page. So if you guys are following along on that note sheet, this is where you would graph this one. So y equals 1/2 cosine of x plus 2. So again, our first step is to start at our midline. Our midline is that last number that we see in our equation. So in this case, our midline would be at 2. So I'm going to plot a line at 2. That just tells me that's where all my middle values are going to go. And then next up is my amplitude. That tells me how high and how low my values go from my midline. So essentially that's meaning that from my midline, I'm going to only go up 1/2 and go down 1/2. So I'm going to plot those points. So plot those lines. Those lines are my barriers. That's how high my graph is going to go, and that's how low my graph is going to go. So this one's pretty short. So if I'm looking at that midline and that amplitude, my maximum, that taller, or that line that's up on the top, that value is at 2.5. So my maximum value is 2.5. That minimum value, the lower line, is at 1.5. So my graph is only going to go up to 2.5, and it's going to go down to 1.5. And that's it. It's just going to stay in that little range. From there, we're just following the pattern. Since we have a cosine function, we're going to follow the cosine pattern, which means that we start high, we go in the middle, we go low, we go back to the middle, and then we go back high. Again, those are at those like mile marker angle measures. So 0, 90, 180, 270, 360. Those are like the pretty important ones. That's going to be where that pattern follows. And then you can add in more points to kind of see that cosine curve a little bit more. Last step is that we are going to talk about writing equations when given a description. So again, that basic trig equation that we've been looking at in this presentation is y equals a sine b of x plus d. We haven't been focusing on the b this time, so we're just going to kind of ignore that for now, not really worry about it. And then remember that that can be sine or it can be cosine depending on what we're given. This a value we talked about stands for amplitude. I'm going to abbreviate it as amp. That d value stands for your midline. So if they're giving us a description, like this first one, it says write an equation for a cosine graph with an amplitude of 1 and a midline of 4. Here, they tell us our amplitude is 1, so that's going to be my a value, because my a value stands for amplitude. Here they say we have a midline of 4. Midline is my d value, so now I know that my d value is going to be a 4. And then right here they say cosine, so I know that my middle trig equation is going to be a cosine. So filling this out, y equals a, again, stands for my amplitude, which is 1. And then I'm going to put cosine in there because we know it's a cosine graph. X, we're not going to worry about that. B, we haven't talked about frequency yet. And then adding in our midline, our D value, which is 4. So this equation, y equals 1 cosine of x plus 4. For this bottom one, write an equation for a sine graph with an amplitude of 2 and a midline of -1. Pulling out the important parts, amplitude of 2 means that my A value is 2. Midline of -1 means that my D value is a -1. And then I'm going to be using the sine because we have a sine graph. So y equals my A value, my amplitude is 2, sine of x, and then my midline or my D value is -1. So y equals 2 sine of x minus 1. That's how you would write an equation if you were given a description. So again, you just plug in your amplitude for A, plug in your midline for D, you've got your equation. Last but not least, at the bottom of your guys' note sheet, you have these equations already written down there for you. What I want you guys to do is to look at those equations and match them to these 5 different graphs on the screen. The first 5 people from every class to email me the correct answers will get some extra credit points. So make sure that you are trying this out, emailing me the correct answers. Look at what the amplitude is versus the midline and kind of match them up from there. Once you are done watching this video, your next step should be to complete the Desmos activity that is on Canvas for you guys. That activity kind of follows in suit with the midline and the amplitude, and now would be the perfect time to do it since you've already taken the notes. And then once you're done with the Desmos activity, then go and watch video number 3 and then complete the other assignment. That's all that I've got for midline and amplitude. If you have any questions on this, you're still kind of confused, feel free to shoot me an email, text me, we can set up a Zoom meeting, anything like that that you guys need to better understand this material, please let me know. All right, bye.